I'm Heather Williams, a Chicago real estate agent who kept my parents in their home for 5 years until they handed it over to my sister as a wedding gift. Imagine sacrificing over $160,000 for people you trusted, only to be blindsided at a celebration meant for love. I stood there, smiling for photos, while my heart shattered behind the flash. Want to know how I found the courage to confront the people who took my loyalty for granted? You're going to want to hear this. If you've ever felt betrayed by the ones you helped most, hit that subscribe button and stick around. This story is for you. Growing up on Maple Street in suburban Chicago, our family home wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of everything stable in my childhood. It was where I learned to ride a bike, where we carved pumpkins every Halloween, and where my mother stood on the porch waving at us as we left for school each day. But behind the white picket fence and the smell of Sunday roasts, subtle cracks in the foundation of our family dynamic were already forming. As the eldest daughter, I quickly became familiar with the expectation that I would manage things on my own. My parents loved me, but their affection often came wrapped in phrases like, "You're strong, you can handle it, and you don't need as much." That sentiment at first felt like pride, like they believed in me more than they did in Melissa, my younger sister. But with time, I realized it was actually a form of dismissal. My needs were constantly weighed against Melissa's, and somehow, hers always seemed more urgent, more deserving of attention. While I learned to pack my own lunches and finish homework alone, Melissa had a chorus of help. What started as small discrepancies became ingrained patterns. Birthday parties, doctor visits, school events, hers were carefully planned. Mine were quietly minimized. I told myself it was normal, that maybe I was just imagining it, but deep down I knew better. The first blatant memory I have of this imbalance was my 10th birthday. I'd been begging for a sleepover with a few close friends and a homemade cake. It was downsized at the last minute just to friends' store-bought cupcakes and an early bedtime. 3 months later, Melissa's 5th birthday looked like a carnival. A bounce house in our backyard, a face painter, and 20 kids screaming with laughter. My parents told me it was because she was still a baby and birthdays were magical at that age. I didn't argue. I just smiled for photos and helped clean up the spilled juice on the porch. By the time we reached our teenage years, the favoritism was undeniable. I waited over a year to get braces, because insurance coverage would improve if we held off. Melissa, she had hers installed the month her orthodontist recommended them. I was gifted driving lessons for my 16th birthday, a practical and appreciated gesture. But when Melissa turned 16, my parents handed her the keys to a used Honda Civic with a giant red bow on top. I clapped and took pictures like the proud sister I was. Even as something inside me ached with quiet resentment, I didn't know how to name at the time. Still, I didn't speak up. I didn't want to be seen as jealous or ungrateful. I told myself I was independent, capable, strong, and those labels became the armor I wore for years. If something was unequal, I'd justify it. If something hurt, I'd bury it. That's how I grew up, being the daughter who required less, so Melissa could always receive more. And I didn't know just how deep that inequality ran until much later when my generosity would be mistaken for servitude. By high school, I had internalized the idea that if I wanted something, I needed to get it myself. Babysitting jobs filled my weekends, and by 16, I was working a register at the neighborhood grocery store after school. I saved every dollar I could, not just to buy things I wanted, but because I had already accepted that no one else would do it for me. That sense of responsibility, while empowering in some ways, was isolating in others. I watched Melissa breeze through those years, her only job being to maintain passing grades, something she barely managed. When I left for college, I had a partial scholarship that covered part of my tuition. The rest came from juggling 3 part-time jobs and scraping together money wherever I could. I often skipped meals to pay for books or rent, and my parents' contribution was modest, just enough to keep the lights on. They always said they were doing what they could. But when Melissa's turn came, suddenly there was enough to pay for full tuition at a private liberal arts college. They said loans would be too stressful for her, that she wasn't built like me. Those words still echo in my mind. She's not like you. And maybe she wasn't. Melissa had always had a softer presence, an artistic flair, and a way of charming people into helping her. But what hurt was the unspoken message that her comfort was more important than my struggle. I wasn't resentful of Melissa herself. I loved Herb. I began to resent the dynamic that had taken root in our family, where her needs were always centered and mine were assumed to be manageable on my own. Collar sharpened that contrast, while I learned to stretch a $20 grocery budget and walk everywhere because I couldn't afford bus fare. Melissa was sharing photos from study abroad trips and art galleries, I watched from behind cracked phone screens as she lived out a version of college that I had never been offered. I didn't confront my parents, I didn't ask why. I just kept working, kept grinding, and reminded myself that this was the path I chose. And to an extent, I chose to be independent. I chose to rise above. But what I didn't choose was the lack of recognition. The expectation that I would always make do while Melissa was always lifted. That was a script someone else wrote for me, and I performed it dutifully until I no longer could. When I graduated in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, the real estate market was collapsing. While others changed majors or gave up entirely, I stayed in the industry I loved. I took an administrative job at a tiny real estate firm, working full-time during the day while studying for my license at night. I lived in a cramped studio with broken furniture, drove a car that stalled in winter, and ate more ramen noodles than I care to admit. And through it all, my parents watched but didn't offer more than the occasional care package or holiday meal. Their silence wasn't cruelty, it was detachment. They admired my drive but never asked how they could help. Their emotional distance was draped in compliments. "You're doing so well, we're so proud of you." But pride doesn't pay rent, and admiration doesn't fix a broken radiator. Still, I smiled. I didn't ask for help because I knew what the answer would be. Melissa needs it more. She always did. And as I slowly climbed a ladder of success, building my client base and developing a specialty in luxury listings, my parents were quietly funding Melissa's whims. She didn't hold a job for more than a few months at a time. One day she was a gallery assistant, the next a yoga instructor. And yet, her phone bill was paid, her rent was covered, and her lifestyle remained effortlessly curated. They never told me outright, but I saw the signs: her new shoes, her frequent brunches, her getaways to expensive retreats. At family gatherings, I noticed the way they gushed about her finding her path, as if every detour was a courageous journey of self-discovery. Meanwhile, I was expected to show up, smile, and listen politely, even as I poured everything I had into my career with no applause. My parents didn't mean harm, but their favoritism wasn't just emotional, it was financial, practical, and deliberate. Still, I held on to the one promise that made it all feel somewhat fair. The house, our family home. The one I loved, the one I believed would one day be mine. They told me often that it would be. They thanked me, tearfully, when I stepped in to help, and I believed them. That belief carried me through 5 years of sacrifice. But on my sister's wedding night, that belief shattered in. I finally saw the truth I had ignored for far too long. The turning point began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. My father's voice was calm, but the underlying request was heavy. "We're falling behind on the mortgage," he said. "Just for a while, could you help us keep things steady?" The recession had hit hard, and I understood the stress they were under. I was finally starting to see success in my real estate career, small wins, but steady helping them felt like the natural thing to do. After all, this was my childhood home, the place where I'd spent years believing I'd one day raise my own children. I agreed to step in without hesitation. The arrangement was casual at first. They asked me to cover the mortgage for a few months until things stabilized. I didn't ask for anything in writing because it was family. I was doing what any daughter would do or sell. I told myself, every month I wired the payment, never once missing it, never asking when I'd be reimbursed. As time went on, months turned into a year, then 2, then 5. 5 years of payments, 5 years of quietly restructuring my own finances to keep their house afloat, all under the assumption that one day, the house would be mine. I'd made peace with the idea that I wasn't the golden child. I wasn't the one whose photos lined the living room wall or whose updates made it into the holiday letters. But this was different. This was tangible. A form of contribution they couldn't ignore. Or so I believed. With each payment, I felt more rooted to that home, more connected to the promise they had made me. I was investing in more than a house. I was investing in the belief that, at last, they saw my value. That this was their way of saying, "You belong." Meanwhile, Melissa got engaged. The wedding was lavish, as expected. A spring affair in Napa Valley with curated menus, flower walls, and a jazz quartet flown in from New Orleans. My contribution to the mortgage continued uninterrupted, even as I quietly paid for my own bridesmaid dress and hotel stay. I didn't resent her for it. Not really. She had always been the center of their attention, and I had long accepted my role on the outskirts. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet question began to stir. If I've been holding this family up in the background, why do I always feel so invisible? That question followed me like a shadow in the months leading up to the wedding. I silenced it the way I always had, by staying busy, By working harder? By being the responsible one? But the shadow grew, becoming heavier with each passing week. It wrapped around me like fog, and by the time the wedding night arrived, it became impossible to ignore. That's when everything changed. That's when the illusion broke. The reception was a blur of champagne flutes, speeches, and choreographed dances. I stood off to the side most of the evening, watching Melissa float from guest to guest like a swan in silk. She was radiant, surrounded by admiration, celebrated at every turn. I smiled when our parents toasted her and her new husband, beaming with pride. And I smiled again when guests asked what I did for a living, those polite, distant smiles that never quite reached the eyes. It wasn't jealousy. It was something deeper, a quiet ache of being unseen. Late that evening, as I helped clean up the bridal suite and gathered discarded gift wrap, I overheard something that stopped me cold. My parents were speaking in hushed but excited tones to Melissa and her husband. "It's our gift to you," my mother said. "The house is yours now. No more rent. You can move in after the honeymoon." I froze. Surely they didn't mean that house. Our house. The one I had been paying for. But as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that was exactly what they meant. And no one had thought to tell me. I don't remember how I left the venue or got back to my hotel room. My ears rang. My chest felt hollow. I had spent 5 years propping up a promise that was never real. I stared at the ceiling that night, questions swirling in my mind. Had they forgotten what I had done? Or worse, had they always intended to erase me from the picture? In that moment, I understood something I'd refused to admit for years. I wasn't just the forgotten daughter, I was the convenient one. The one who could be relied on, used, and then discarded when no longer needed. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever imagined. Not because of the house itself, but because of what it represented: trust, respect, acknowledgement. I didn't care about square footage or ownership papers. I cared that my sacrifices had meant nothing. That they had smiled at me all those years while silently planning to give it all away. The narrative I had clung to for so long shattered in a single evening, and in the silence that followed, I was left with one truth. If I didn't reclaim my voice now, I never would. That night became the genesis of my transformation. I wouldn't confront them immediately, not yet, but I made a promise to myself I would no longer accept the role of the silent provider. I would no longer shrink myself to keep the peace. I had built a life of my own, with my own hands, and it was time to stand in that truth. They had given the house to Melissa, but I was about to claim something far more valuable: my agency. The days that followed were quiet, but charged. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not even my boyfriend at the time. I needed space to process, to understand what this revelation meant for me and for the story I had been telling myself. I went to work like usual, closed deals like usual, smiled like usual, but beneath the surface, something was shifting. I wasn't broken, I was waking up. I began to look back at every sacrifice I had made through a different lens. The skipped vacations, the postponed dreams, the way I never asked for help because I was told I didn't need it. I had worn strength like a badge of honor, but now I saw it for what it was: a permission slip for others to neglect me. I wasn't strong because I had to, but I was strong because they refused to be strong for me. A few weeks after the wedding, I gathered the paperwork. Bank statements, transfer receipts, every record of every payment I had made toward that mortgage. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but collecting it felt like reclaiming a part of myself. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't exaggerating. The numbers were there. The truth was there. And it was no longer going to be hidden beneath family smiles and polite conversations. Around that time, Melissa posted a photo online, her and her new husband standing in front of the house, holding a home sweet home sign. My hands trembled as I looked at it. The caption read, "So grateful to Mom and Dad for this incredible start. Couldn't have done it without you." There was no mention of me. No mention of what I had done to make that possible. I closed the app and stared out my window. I wasn't just excluded, I was erased. But that post also gave me clarity. I had a choice. I could stay in the shadows, bitter and silent, or I could step forward fully, unapologetically, and on my own terms. I chose the latter. What they had given away was bricks and wood. What I was about to build would be unshakable. My voice, my identity, my story. And I was just getting started. It didn't happen all at once. The exclusion came like slow erosion, subtle at first, disguised as oversight. I remember the first time they didn't ask for my input on a family decision involving the house. It was smaller, new roof installation, but it stunk. I had been paying the mortgage, yet no one consulted me. Melissa, meanwhile, was looped into every discussion, her opinion treated as fact. I told myself it was a fluke, but in my gut, I knew better. What began as subtle became systematic. I'd show up to family dinners and realize decisions had been made without me. Furniture replaced, rooms repainted, changes to the garden all while I was footing the bill. They never asked me to stop paying. In fact, they never even acknowledged it. The mortgage transfers continued like clockwork, and I kept hoping someone would say, "Thank you." But silence became their answer. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. At holidays, I noticed how I was seated at the edge of the table, how my stories were cut short while Melissa's were celebrated. She'd talk about renovating her condo, and our parents would beam. I mentioned a project I closed and got a polite nod. The hierarchy wasn't spoken aloud, but it was enforced in every gesture. I had internalized that I needed to work twice as hard just to be tolerated, let alone praised. And still, I remained committed. I justified it by telling myself I was strong, that real love meant sacrifice, that one day they'd see it. But that belief was beginning to rot inside me. When you're raised to believe that pleasing others is your highest worth, it's easy to miss when you're being exploited. I wasn't just overlooked, I was tolerated when useful and discarded when inconvenient. That's not love. That's manipulation dressed in family clothing. Still, I didn't confront them. Not yet. I kept showing up, kept sending the payments, kept swallowing the bitterness. I wore a mask so tight it began to feel like my skin, and they never once asked how I was doing. It was easier for them to believe I didn't feel anything at all. People love to mislabel independence when it suits them. They called me self-sufficient, driven, the one who never needs help. But what they really meant was, we don't have to check on her. Independence became a convenient excuse for my family's neglect. It let them off the hook. If I didn't cry or beg, I must not feel hurt. If I was successful on paper, I must not need support. But being capable doesn't mean I didn't crave connection. They praised my resilience the way you might admire a machine called precise, efficient. Never once asking what fueled that drive. Never once acknowledging the cost. I took care of everyone. I remembered birthdays, sent gifts, showed up for graduations and funerals. But when it came time for someone to show up for me, the room was always empty. Being the strong one is isolating. It makes you easy to forget. The most painful part wasn't that they ignored my sacrifices, it was that they expected them. They assumed I'd keep giving because I always had. They mistook my silence for agreement, my generosity for permission. Melissa once told me I was too independent to care about the house anyway. I laughed it off at the time, but her words cut deep. How could she not see what that house meant to me? How could none of them? When I finally stopped minimizing my feelings, everything changed. I started writing it all down, every memory, every slight, every unspoken expectation. It was like opening floodgates. For so long, I thought I was imagining the imbalance, that maybe I was just sensitive. But the pattern was too consistent, too calculated. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a structure, and I was meant to remain at the bottom of it. That realization didn't break, MIT clarified me. I wasn't broken or needy or dramatic. I was hurt, and I had every right to be. You don't need to justify your pain to people who refuse to see it. What I needed wasn't pity, it was recognition. And if I couldn't get that from them, I would give it to myself. The breaking point wasn't loud, it was quiet. Almost too quiet. It came on a Sunday afternoon, weeks after the wedding, when I visited the house unannounced. I wanted to see it one last time to say goodbye. The front door was open, laughter echoing from the kitchen. I stepped inside and immediately felt it. I didn't belong. Melissa was there, barefoot, holding a wine glass, giving a tour to friends. She introduced it as her place, and no one blinked. I stood frozen in the doorway as she showed them the reading nook. My reading nook. The one I'd insisted they preserve when renovations were planned. The one I'd painted myself during one long, cathartic weekend. We're thinking of converting it into a nursery, she said. My stomach flipped. I turned and left before anyone noticed I had arrived. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I just drove in silence, white-knuckling the wheel all the way home. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up every transfer receipt I had ever made. I organized them by date, by amount, by memo line. 5 years. Nearly $80,000. The numbers didn't lie. My memory didn't lie. I didn't need to beg for validation. I had given more than enough. And now, I was going to stop. Not out of bitterness, but because I was done participating in a system built to keep me silent. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about how I had allowed myself to be treated, about the ways I dimmed my own light to preserve relationships that were never reciprocal. I had silenced myself to keep others comfortable, but comfort was no longer my priority. Truth was, boundaries were, self-worth was. So I stopped all payments. I didn't announce it. I didn't justify it. I simply stopped. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Not because I'd walked away from them, but because I had walked back to myself. After I stopped the payments, the silence was deafening. No one called, no one asked why. The money stopped flowing, but the pattern held firm. Their silence was its own kind of message, louder than any confrontation could have been. It confirmed what I'd feared. They noticed me only when I was useful. Weeks passed. I thought perhaps someone would reach out, even Melissa, but there was nothing. Not a text, not a voicemail. The lack of reaction was worse than outrage. It told me I'd been replaced long ago in their minds, that my love had been accepted, but never reciprocated. They'd grown comfortable with my absence. I walked around my apartment like I was grieving something, and in many ways, I had lost the illusion that I mattered to them the way they mattered to me. I had clung to the fantasy of family unity, of parental love being unconditional. But now I saw it for what it was: transactional, conditional, and cold. I started remembering little things, times I'd been left behind, forgotten, minimized. It was like my mind had waited for permission to unload it all. And now that I had drawn a boundary, the flood came. I realized how much I'd given away my time, my energy, my peace, all to prove I was worthy. But I was already worthy. So I made a vow to myself: no more silence, no more erasing my own needs to protect others from discomfort. If they wouldn't hold space for me, I'd hold it for myself. The healing had to start somewhere, and it would begin with truth, no matter how lonely that truth felt at first. Taking back your power doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it's just opening your eyes to the truth and refusing to close them again. That's what happened when I reread the legal paperwork. The deed, the mortgage, transfers. My name wasn't anywhere. Not once. And that wasn't an oversight. It was by design. I'd paid for something I had no legal claim to. A house that still bore the memories of my childhood, yes, but that had never been mine. Not even in recognition. Melissa's name, however, was already being added. My parents had planned this. Every smile at dinner, every thank you for covering the mortgage. It was all performance. I could have screamed, I could have sued. But I chose something different. I chose to reclaim what I could control: my narrative, my peace, my dignity. They had the house, but I had the truth. And that truth, it burned through every illusion they'd tried to feed me. I wasn't ungrateful. I was betrayed. So I wrote it all down. A letter I would never send. Line by line, I laid it bare: the hurt, the disillusionment, the clarity. And when I was done, I read it aloud to myself. My voice didn't shake. I didn't cry. I stood in the middle of my living room and honored myself in a way my family never had. That night, I slept for 10 uninterrupted hours. No anxiety, no dread, just rest. Because knowing the truth, even when it's painful, is better than living inside a lie. Especially when the lie is that you're loved, but only when you're convenient. Freedom came in small moments. Waking up and not checking my phone for their texts. Walking past a family photo and no longer feeling the sting. Making breakfast in silence, but not feeling lonely. Just ... calm. Like I had peeled off a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. I started journaling again. Creating art not for clients, but for myself. I painted my own version of the house, how it looked in my memory. Golden light, warm textures, laughter in the kitchen. A version that no longer existed in reality, but still lived in me. I cried when I finished it, not from sadness, but release. I began reconnecting with the people who had always seen me clearly: friends, mentors, colleagues, people who celebrated my work, asked about my dreams, remembered my birthday without a reminder. The contrast was jarring. They never asked me to prove my worth. I just was. And that was enough. I didn't need the house. I didn't need their approval. What I needed was space to grieve, to feel, to breathe. And slowly, I was making that space for myself. One boundary at a time. One morning without guilt at a time. One quiet, powerful choice at a time. It was the beginning of a different kind of life. One where I wasn't the good daughter or the dutiful sibling or the silent provider. I was just me. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. Once I stopped trying to earn love, everything became quieter. I didn't realize how much of my life had been organized around keeping the peace with people who never truly considered my needs. Every visit, every check, every phone call was a performance. One where I played the role they liked best. Agreeable, available, silent. Without that script, I had space to rewrite my own. And that started with deciding who got access to me. Not everyone deserves front row seats in your life just because they share your last name. Family isn't about proximity, it's about presence, consistency, honesty, all things I had given freely but rarely received in return. So I stopped answering out of guilt. I stopped showing up out of obligation. I started checking in with myself before responding to anyone else. Do I want this conversation? Does it serve me? Will it cost me my peace? If the answer was no, I allowed myself to step back, without guilt, without explanation. People noticed. Some accused me of being distant. Others were quietly relieved because it forced them to confront their own role in our family dynamic. But I didn't owe anyone a justification for protecting my energy. I had been available for everyone else for years. Now I was becoming available to myself. And the more I did that, the more I healed, not just from the house betrayal, but from a lifetime of invisible wounds. Boundaries weren't rejection. They were revelation. They revealed who loved me, not for what I gave, but for who I was when I gave nothing at all. Choosing yourself isn't an act of war, it's an act of return. I was returning to the version of me that existed before I was told I had to earn everything, including love. And the moment I stopped chasing approval, my real life started. A life defined by truth, not performance. Alignment, not obligation. It started with small things. I said no without explanations. I turned down family dinners that felt more like emotional landmines. I stopped financing comfort for people who had consistently denied mine. I invested that energy into myself, into my business, my friendships, my healing. And the results were immediate. Work flourished. Clients responded to my confidence. Friends leaned in closer. My therapist said I looked lighter. Even strangers noticed something had shifted because I had shed the guilt that had wrapped itself around my decisions for years. And I wasn't looking back. That's the thing about choosing yourself. It costs relationships you thought were forever, but it gifts you ones that are honest, nourishing, and mutual. I lost some family connections, but I gained a deeper connection with myself and with people who saw me clearly without needing me to shrink or sacrifice. And in that space, I finally began to dream again. Not survival dreams, not prove your worth dreams, but real ones. Dreams with color and shape and freedom. Dreams that didn't come with strings attached, just possibility. The lake house became my sanctuary. Once, I thought of it only as an investment property income. Tax deductions, long-term value, but after the betrayal, it became something far more personal. It was mine, untouched by family expectations. A space where I didn't owe anyone anything. Just peace, just stillness. I began spending weekends there alone. I'd wake to the sound of water, bird song, and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but restorative. I decorated it slowly, with pieces that reflected who I was becoming. Art that made me feel something. Furniture that comforted me, not just looked good in photos. I added a reading nook by the window. Painted the walls myself one rainy afternoon, with music blasting and zero interruptions. Every brushstroke was a reclamation of agency, of ownership. This was a space built by my hands, not one gifted with expectations attached. No one could take it from me. Eventually, it became a place where I invited only those who understood its meaning. Friends who had walked with me through my healing. Colleagues who respected boundaries. New connections who showed up with honesty and grace. The lake house wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything I had learned. And most importantly, it was mine, because I chose it, not because anyone gave it to me. That choice mattered more than I could have imagined. It was a physical reminder that my life was no longer built on someone else's terms. Growing up, I was always the responsible one. The one who didn't ask for much. The one who understood. That label felt like a compliment until I realized it was just code for, we expect you to carry more without complaint. It gave my parents permission to ignore my needs. Every time I stepped up, they stepped back. And the moment I asked for something in return, I was suddenly difficult, ungrateful, cold. But I wasn't any of those things. I was exhausted. And breaking free from that label meant confronting how much of my identity had been shaped by someone else's neglect. It wasn't easy. Sometimes I doubted myself. Was I really being unfair? Had I expected too much? But the more I looked at the facts, 5 years of mortgage payments, thousands in support, and still being treated like a footnote, the more clarity I found. My worth was never in question. Their treatment was, so I stopped being the understanding one. I became the woman who asked hard questions. Who held people accountable? Who didn't let love be an excuse for mistreatment? And though some called it a phase, I knew it was a transformation. I wasn't breaking down, I was breaking free. Because real love doesn't require silence or sacrifice or shrinking. It requires truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And I had finally found the courage to live mine. There's something radical about a woman who says no without explaining. I had spent most of my life cushioning my no with reasons, reassurances, apologies. But the first time I just said no to my parents' request to use my lake house, everything changed. It was terrifying and liberating. They looked stunned, as if I had broken some unspoken family code. But the truth is, that code was never fair to begin with. It had always required me to put my well-being last. That day, I rewrote it, and my no echoed louder than any argument I could have made. People think saying no ends relationships. Sometimes it does, but more often, it reveals their foundation. If someone only values you when you're useful to them, that's not love, it's convenience. My no stripped away the illusion, and what remained was honest, raw, real. It's not just about refusing requests, it's about reclaiming your agency. Saying no to what drains you, saying yes to what restores you, saying, I'm not available for roles that require me to abandon myself. That shift didn't just change my family dynamic. It changed how I moved through the world. And slowly, people began responding differently, with more respect, more caution, more care. Because when you respect yourself enough to say no, others take notice. And those who don't, they fall away. And that's a gift too. Healing isn't just letting go, it's rebuilding. I didn't want to just survive this chapter. I wanted to emerge from it with clarity, purpose, and strength. That meant rewriting the story I told myself about family, love, and worth. It meant becoming the author of my life, not a character in someone else's drama. I started small. Therapy sessions, journaling every morning, revisiting old dreams I'd shelved to support others. I created rituals that honored my growth: weekend coffee alone, new books each month, even solo travel. These weren't escapes. They were returns. To myself, my rhythm, my values. The more I leaned into that rebuilding, the less I looked back. I stopped needing apologies to move forward. I stopped waiting for someone else to validate my pain. I validated it myself. And from that place of deep self-recognition, I began to trust again, not others, but my own judgment. Rebuilding meant redefining success. Not just professional wins, but emotional stability, peace, boundaries honored, relationships that felt mutual. I didn't need a perfect family to feel whole. I just needed honesty, clarity, and the courage to live according to my own blueprint. That's what I found. In the quiet, in the work, in the stillness, not just healing, but liberation. And I wasn't going to trade that for anything, not even approval. There's a silence that feels heavy, like grief. And then there's the silence that feels like armor. Mine became the latter. After years of explaining, justifying, and softening my truth to make others comfortable, I simply stopped. I stopped responding, explaining, performing. I let the silence speak. When Melissa texted me about her dream renovation, I didn't answer. When extended family sent guilt-laced messages, I stayed quiet, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did about myself. I learned that some things are better left unanswered. That silence wasn't passive, it was protective. A wall built not to keep love out, but to keep manipulation from seeping in. Every ignored message became a statement. I will not engage on your terms anymore. It wasn't cold, it was sacred. A choice to preserve my energy. People noticed, some backed off, others got louder, more insistent. But none of them deserved an explanation from me. Not anymore. I didn't need to justify my distance to those who never justified their betrayals. The silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. And in that space, I started to hear something new. My own voice, clear, steady, unapologetic. The silence gave birth to strength I didn't know I had. I remembered the exact moment it clicked for them. My parents had come to talk, a conversation dressed as a demand. They assumed I'd cave, like always, that I'd hear their story and offer the lake house. But this time, I didn't. I stayed calm, collected, professional. I laid out facts, my contributions, their choices, the consequences. I didn't yell or cry, simply refused. And that shook them more than any outburst ever could. Because silence with boundaries, that's power they didn't expect. My father tried appealing to sentiment, after all we've done for you. My mother clung to the word temporary, as if downplaying the request would soften the truth. But I didn't budge. I had built a life of my own, and they weren't entitled to a single piece of it. That's when it hit them. I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't playing hard to get. I was gone. Emotionally, energetically, financially. Their access had expired, and I wasn't issuing extensions. They had built a relationship on convenience, and I had closed the account. They left that day confused, maybe hurt. But more importantly, they left empty-handed. For once, I kept what was mine. Setting boundaries doesn't just protect you, it reflects others. My no didn't just block an expectation. It exposed a pattern. And for the first time, my parents had to sit with the mirror I held up. What they saw wasn't flattering, but it was real. They realized they hadn't been supportive parents. They'd been beneficiaries of my silence. And now that silence had become a barrier, they were desperate to cross. But the terms had changed. I wasn't the same daughter who put their needs first, blindly. At first, they resisted, tried reframing their actions as parental decisions. But eventually, cracks formed. My father's apology was the first sign, a real one. Not performative, not manipulative, just honest. That mirror I held up. He looked into it and he didn't look away. My mother struggled more. Her identity was wrapped in the image of a mother who did everything for her children, but even she began to falter, to ask questions. And that shift didn't come from confrontation. It came from the boundary itself, from seeing who I was without guilt. That mirror changed them, but it changed me more. I no longer needed to prove my worth. I had already reclaimed it fully. Finally, once the noise quieted, I realized how much of my life had been lived in reaction. I wasn't just setting boundaries, I was rebuilding my foundation. For years, my actions had revolved around preventing disappointment, earning approval, proving I was good enough. No more. With distance came clarity. I returned to routines I loved, quiet mornings at the lake house, cooking just for myself, painting like I did before college. My time became mine again, my choices, too. I didn't need their permission, I needed my own presence. I picked up my journal again and wrote everything I'd been afraid to say out loud, all the moments I felt invisible, the years I sacrificed while being told I was so lucky. The truth spilled out, not for revenge, but for release, for freedom, and slowly, healing began. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gently. I cried less, laughed more. My body felt lighter, my decisions sharper, and I realized that while they may have taken my trust, they hadn't touched my resilience. Rebuilding didn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It meant rising in spite of it. Not to prove anything, but because I was finally free. Growing up, loyalty meant silence, compliance, taking care of others even when it hurt. But now, loyalty looked different. It started with me, with protecting my peace, my time, my resources, no longer pouring into a well that never filled back. I had to unlearn the guilt that came with saying no. I'd internalized this belief that love meant sacrifice, that to be good, I had to be available, generous, endlessly forgiving. But real loyalty doesn't demand self-betrayal. It honors truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Loyalty to family had become a leash. They used it to tug me back every time I tried to step into autonomy. But I cut that leash. Not to sever connection, but to reclaim choice. To decide what kind of daughter I wanted to be, not what they expected. I still valued family, but not at the cost of my dignity. Not at the expense of fairness. Melissa was never expected to give, only to receive. And I was done playing both giver and ghost. My loyalty wasn't going, it was just redirected. Now, it belonged to the one person who had always shown up for me, no matter what, me. There's a power that doesn't need to shout. It doesn't storm out or slam doors. It sits, it breathes, it waits. That was the power I found in stillness. Not the frantic proving of my 20s, but the quiet certainty of a woman who knows her worth. I didn't rush to repair what they broke. I let it stay broken. I watched the discomfort ripple through the family. The awkward silences, the absence of texts, the uncomfortable glances at gatherings, and I stayed still. Not cold, just clear. They tried to bait me back into the old role. The fixer, the bridge builder, the peacemaker, but I didn't move. I didn't engage. I wasn't angry. I was anchored, rooted in the truth that I was no longer responsible for their emotional comfort. That stillness became a magnet. First my father, then eventually my mother. They came not because I begged, but because they finally felt the space I used to fill. And in that space, they had to look at themselves. Not me, not Melissa, themselves. Power isn't loud, it's presence. And I was fully present in my life. In my choices, in my healing. After months of silence, I knew words alone wouldn't shift the dynamic. So I crafted the email calm, firm, and factual. I listed every contribution, mortgage payments, home repairs, medical bills. I wasn't asking for repayment. I was demanding acknowledgement. I didn't write to guilt them, I wrote to liberate myself. It wasn't anger that guided my words, it was clarity. And that email, simple as it seemed, did something profound. It ended the cycle of assumed obligation. It ended my silence. When I hit send, I felt fear. Not of their reaction, but of who I would be without that tether. For years, I defined myself through their needs, their approval. What would remain now that I'd stopped reaching backward? Their reply came fast, defensive, dramatic, guilt-ridden, but it didn't touch me the way it used to. I saw through the manipulation. I wasn't cold, I was awake. An awakening doesn't always bring applause. Sometimes it brings backlash. Still, that email marked the shift. I had stopped waiting for them to see me. I had seen myself in the quiet days. After sending that message, I began tallying not just dollars, but dreams. The property I could have owned, the investments I delayed, the conferences I skipped to save for their bills, the energy I poured into their comfort. I hadn't just lost money, I had lost time, lost milestones, lost momentum. I was 34, successful on paper, but behind on personal goals I'd shelved in the name of being the good daughter. The weight of that hit hard, harder than betrayal. Every dollar I gave up had a cost that wasn't financial. It was emotional, and every yes to them had been a no to me. I could have taken a sabbatical, traveled, explored love without exhaustion, clouding my judgment. I gave those years away. But as painful as that realization was, it lit a fire in me. Not a fire of revenge, but redemption. I would reclaim what I could. I would rebuild, not for their approval, but for the future. I still had power to shape, and I would never again apologize for putting myself first. After that last message, I stopped responding. Not out of pettiness, but preservation. Every word I didn't send was a choice to protect my healing. I didn't need another argument. I needed quiet space, my own voice. They filled the silence with their own discomfort. Phone calls, voicemails, passive-aggressive messages from extended family. But I didn't move. I let their unease sit with them. For once, I wasn't the emotional cushion they could fall back on. It was strange at first, like walking through my house in the dark and not turning on the lights. But eventually, I realized I wasn't alone in that darkness. I was becoming someone new. Someone unburdened by guilt disguised as duty. In that stillness, I discovered strength. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that says, I see what you've done and I will no longer carry it for you. I didn't need closure. I needed distance. And silence gave me both. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. When Melissa texted me weeks after the fallout, it wasn't an apology, it was a selfie of her standing in my old bedroom, now painted teal with a boho mirror over the fireplace, making big changes. Come see before it's all different. The tone was cheerful, oblivious, as if the past didn't exist, as if the betrayal hadn't happened. I stared at the screen, stunned at how easily she erased everything. I didn't reply. Instead, I stared at that picture until my throat tightened, then forwarded it to Rachel without comment. She read it once, took my phone from my hand, and blocked the number. Not helpful right now, she said softly, and she was right. That single act felt like closing the door to a burning room. What shook me wasn't just the text, it was what it revealed. Melissa didn't see me, didn't see my sacrifice, my anger, my heartbreak. She saw space, a room, a fresh start for her. Her life moved forward on the bones of mine, and she never looked back. Blocking her wasn't punishment. It was survival. And with that block, I drew a line in the sand I hadn't dared to before. Setting boundaries had always felt cruel to me, like withholding love, like being difficult. That's what I'd been taught. Be agreeable, helpful, low maintenance. But now, I understood something vital. Real boundaries don't hurt people. They protect relationships. Without them, resentment builds. Respect erodes, the connection withers. So I created new rules, not for revenge, but for restoration. No more unscheduled visits. No more unspoken expectations. No more silent sacrifices in exchange for silence from them. I drafted them on paper, not to share, but to anchor myself in the clarity I finally found. I needed structure before I could offer grace. Then came their visit to my condo, lasagna and wine in hand. A peace offering wrapped in assumption. They still believed they could charm their way past what they refused to face. But I didn't soften. I didn't rescue. I listened. Then I said no to the lake house, to their narrative, to the cycle of emotional blackmail. It shocked them. They blinked like I'd spoken a foreign language. But I stood still. I stood tall. Because finally, I wasn't negotiating my worth, I was declaring it. And the world didn't end. It began. What followed wasn't triumph, it was grief. Grief for the years I spent giving to people who couldn't hold my trust. Grief for the childhood I spent proving my value. Grief for the fantasy of a family that would one day treat me as more than useful. It was a slow, aching process. But it made room for something better. I started showing up for myself the way I had always shown up for them. I reinvested the emotional labor I used to give away, reconnected with friends I'd let drift, took weekends for myself, visited the lake house without guilt. I remembered who I was outside the role of the strong one. The version of me they relied on, the fixer. The financier, the peacemaker, was no longer available. And in her place stood someone softer, but stronger. Boundaries gave me back my time, my clarity, my voice, and the freedom to choose what love meant, on my terms. The house may have gone to Melissa, but I reclaimed something far more valuable. I reclaimed myself. The silence after my refusal was thunderous. For weeks, I heard nothing, not a text, not a call. I should have felt peace. But in its place, there was a strange, quiet tension, like standing outside a locked door with someone breathing on the other side. I kept waiting for confrontation, guilt, or one last manipulation. What came instead was a voicemail.com almost rehearsed. Your mother and I have been thinking about our living situation. He sounded detached, like someone explaining the weather. They were considering options. He said, Melissa and Brandon needed privacy, and the house had become too big. Not once did he mention what they had done, just a vague suggestion that we should talk. It was bait wrapped in pleasantries. I let it sit, untouched, like spoiled fruit, but I couldn't stop thinking about the implications. Had they given everything away with no plan for themselves? Did they assume I'd come to the rescue again? The realization burned through my chest. They had treated me like a safety net for so long, they forgot I was a person. I had boundaries now, and I wasn't rushing in to fix what they had broken. Not anymore. A week later, a new message arrived, this time from my mother. Softer, sweeter. We're having a small family dinner Sunday. There are some things we'd like to discuss. The tone was gentle, but I'd learned to hear what lived underneath her voice. This wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. A test. A door cracked open just enough to draw me in again. I stared at the message for 10 minutes. My thumb hovered over the reply. I could feel the old reflex rising: oblige, comply, keep the peace. But peace had come at the cost of my worth. I responded with a simple excuse. Can't make it work. It was technically true, but even if it hadn't been, I wouldn't have gone. My absence wasn't revenge, was recovery. Their messages grew more frequent. Hints about transition, hints about downsizing, eventually not so subtle nods toward the lake house. My lake house, the place I had carved out of commission checks and solitude. They wanted it, that was obvious. But they hadn't earned access, not to the space, and not to me. Their need didn't erase their betrayal. That was a lesson I had learned the hard way, and I wasn't about to forget it now. They showed up unannounced on a Tuesday. I got the call from my doorman. There's a Richard and Diane here to see you. My breath caught. For a moment I considered pretending I wasn't home, but then I remembered I had nothing to hide. They did. I agreed to let them up. I had already begun drafting my boundaries in my head before the elevator dinged. They brought wine, lasagna, nostalgia, and Tupperware. My mother smiled like nothing had happened, like we were still the family that laughed over Sunday dinners. My father made small talk about the weather, my neighborhood, the view. They danced around the reason for their visit for exactly 12 minutes. Then my mother said it. We were thinking about your lake house, and there it was. Not a question, a presumption. As if my sacrifice entitled them to my sanctuary. As if the last 5 years had vanished in their minds. And I owed them a roof. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said, that won't be possible. The room shifted. Their faces stiffened. but I held the line and I didn't flinch. My father's tone shifted first. Gone was the cordial civility. "Heather, you're being dramatic," he said, like I was the one rewriting history. My mother followed with, "We've done so much for you." I felt the familiar pressure rise, guilt disguised as love, manipulation masked as obligation. They leaned into a script I'd heard my whole life. "We raised you, we gave you everything." But now I could see the gaps, the things they withheld, the sacrifices they demanded from me while sparing my sister. I reminded them, clearly and calmly, what those years had cost me. The mortgage payments, the property taxes, the countless repairs, my mother's medical bills, 5 years of redirecting my own dreams to stabilize theirs. They sat in silence. At first, then my father scoffed. "That's what family does." As if loyalty should have no limits. As if betrayal was acceptable when done by blood. Their argument wasn't about fairness, it was about familiarity. They were used to my yes, to my silence, to my acceptance of imbalance. But this version of me, the one who saw through the emotional currency they used to buy compliance, that version terrified them. Because they no longer had control. And for once, I wasn't giving it back. After they left, I called Rachel. My voice shook, but my resolve didn't. "They want the lake house," I said, trying not to laugh bitterly. Within the hour, she arrived along with Julia and a bottle of tequila. We sat on my couch, reliving the conversation, dissecting every manipulative phrase. Rachel's outrage burned like fire. Julia offered comfort with her fierce logic. "You don't owe them anything," she said. And she was right. That night, we drafted my response not out of vengeance, but clarity. I would not offer the lake house. I would not resume financial support, and any relationship from now on would require genuine accountability. I printed a list of affordable rentals in their area and added information on senior housing options. The folder became a symbol, not of rejection, but of boundaries. Of saying, here's what I can do, and here's what I won't do. I wasn't turning my back on family. I was refusing to be buried under their expectations any longer. Rachel raised her glass to that decision. We toasted not just to freedom, but to finally seeing things as they were. The night ended with laughter and tears, but mostly peace. The kind of peace that comes from choosing yourself. I picked the coffee shop carefully, public but private enough. Neutral ground, I arrived early. Folder in hand, resolve like armor. When they walked in, my mother looked nervous. My father, composed. They sat across from me as if they were still in control. But I had changed. I wasn't there to explain, I was there to declare. Calmly, I told them, my answer is no. No lake house. No more support, no more rescuing. My mother blinked rapidly. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, voice trembling. "You should have thought of that before giving away your home," I replied. My father tried his usual line, "We raised you better than this." But I was ready. Exactly. Which is why I'm setting boundaries now. That is what you raised me for, right? I slid the folder across the table. My mother didn't even open it. Their shock didn't move me. Their guilt couldn't bend me. I told them the truth. This wasn't about money, it was about respect. And they had shown me none when they handed Melissa the house. When they pretended I didn't matter. The conversation ended with no handshakes, no hugs, just clarity. And for the first time, the power wasn't in their hands. That evening, my phone lit up with Melissa's name from a new number I hadn't blocked yet. Her voice, tight with outrage, spilled through the speaker. "You left them homeless," she shouted, as if I'd ripped the roof off myself. She accused me of being jealous, of being cruel. I let her rant, and when I finally tried to explain, she cut me off with venom. Brandon and I would never treat family this way. Then came the silence. Call ended. Just like that. The guilt wave came fast. Until I remembered the truth. I had never left them homeless. I had been their roof, their floor, their financial lifeline for years. But now that I refused to be used, I was suddenly the villain. It was stunning how quickly gratitude becomes resentment when entitlement is denied. The very people I had sustained were now the ones trying to rewrite the narrative. It was infuriating. Then came the uncles and aunts, the cousins I barely spoke to. They sent passive-aggressive texts, posted cryptic quotes about loyalty and gratitude. People who hadn't seen my sacrifice suddenly had opinions. It stung, yes, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I responded once, just once. I sent a detailed email listing every payment I had made, every sacrifice they'd all ignored. Then I hit send. and blocked every number that needed blocking. In the weeks that followed, I felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Like I could finally exhale without checking if it inconvenienced someone. My lake house stayed quiet, my phone stopped buzzing. I dove into work, booked back-to-back showings, and started every morning with purpose, not dread. I wasn't spinning plates for everyone else anymore. And that was freedom. Therapy became a lighthouse. Each session peeled back another layer, how I'd learned to overfunction. How silence became my survival strategy. We connected dots from childhood to now. And with every realization, my spine straightened a bit more. I wasn't broken. I was conditioned to be the fixer, the giver, the one who never asked for anything in return. But not anymore. I started saying yes to things I had put off for years. A weekend art class, a hiking trip with friends, a date with someone who actually asked how I was feeling. Life opened up like a window I hadn't realized was closed. The air was clearer, the sky bluer, and my own company. It was enough. No noise, no guilt, just me. And that was more than okay. It was sacred. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I sat down with a cup of black coffee, opened a clean spreadsheet, and documented everything I had poured into that house. Every transfer, every receipt, every forgotten sacrifice. The numbers stared back at me like a mirror. Over $165,000 across 5 years. And still, I had been treated like a side character in my own story. That spreadsheet wasn't for revenge. It was my closure. A record that I wasn't imagining it. That my value had been real, measurable, undeniable. That I hadn't just helped a little, I had sustained them. That realization shifted something inside me. No more pretending, no more minimizing. No more explaining myself to people who would rather forget the math than face the truth. So I made decisions. Hard ones. I contacted a financial advisor, asked the right questions, faced the facts. Her advice was blunt and necessary. Cut off support. Protect your assets. Decide what kind of relationship you want moving forward. I nodded slowly. It was sobering, but empowering. I had the right to stop bleeding for people who never brought bandages. I didn't owe anyone access to what I had built through struggle, especially not those who watched me drown while holding umbrellas. That night, I wrote them an email. No emotion, no long-winded explanations, just facts. Line by line, I listed every dollar I had contributed. I reminded them of the agreement they made, the promise that the house would one day be mine. I wasn't asking for money back. I wasn't threatening them. I was declaring the end of my silence. The tone was intentional, firm, professional, not angry. Because anger wouldn't change them, but boundaries might. I told them I was ending all financial contributions, effective immediately. That my support was over, and that if they ever wanted a relationship with me again, it would begin with accountability, not manipulation. Then I hit send. Their response came quickly. A long, dramatic monologue filled with guilt trips. My mother played the martyr. My father played the disappointed victim. They didn't apologize. They didn't own anything. They called me transactional as if money had replaced love, but they ignored what I had actually asked for. Respect, not repayment, not praise. Just acknowledgement of what they had done. And because they couldn't give that, I gave myself something they never would. Distance. Weeks passed. Then the calls began again. Not about reconciliation, but about real estate. They had given away their house. Now they were being asked to leave. Apparently, Melissa and Brandon, whose marriage was already cracking, one in privacy. My parents, unsurprisingly, had no backup plan, so they looked toward me again. But they didn't ask. They hinted, they danced around it. They sent soft texts about needing a quiet space. They referenced my lake house casually like it was a family cabin rather than my personal investment. Then one evening, they showed up at my condo. No warning. Lasagna in hand, nostalgia in their eyes. Trying to rewrite the script with comfort food, I sat them down, listened politely. And when they finally floated the idea just for a few months, just until they found something, I told them no. Calmly, clearly, without apology. That house is not available. I said, it's mine. I purchased it, I maintain it. And I'm not offering it for temporary housing. They were stunned. Accused me of being cold, said, this isn't how we raised you. But maybe. I thought, that's the problem. I agreed to meet them one final time in public. A neutral coffee shop. Not to argue, not to explain again what they already refused to understand. But to close the door they kept nudging open. I wore a blazer, brought printed documents, notes, rental listings, not out of cruelty, but to give them something they clearly weren't willing to get for themselves. Reality. They arrived, cheerful, pretending everything was normal. "We've raised you better than this," my father said when I reiterated my refusal. My mother looked genuinely confused. "But we're your parents. What are we supposed to do now?" That question rang in my head, not because it was unfair, but because I had asked myself the same thing 5 years earlier when I chose to save them. So I slid the folder across the table. "These are apartments you can afford. This is your next step." They didn't thank me. They didn't even look at the listings. Instead, they blamed me for their position. "Melissa was supposed to be our security," my father said under his breath. The truth slipped out like a crack in the facade. And I realized then I had never really been their plan, only their backup. It hurt, but it also set me free, because I refused to be anyone's emergency exit ever again. The backlash came fast. Melissa called first, accusing me of being cruel, jealous. "Brandon and I would never turn our backs on family," she said, conveniently forgetting I had funded the family while she brunch hopped her way through life. She didn't want reconciliation. She wanted the version of me that sacrificed without complaint. That version was gone. Next came the extended family. Relatives who hadn't texted me in years suddenly weighed in. "How could you abandon your aging parents? Don't forget who raised you." My inbox flooded with guilt-trapped lectures, and not one of them had ever sent a single check or made a mortgage payment. I sent one email in response, a breakdown of what I had contributed, a statement of facts, and a request for privacy. Then I hit block. My peace wasn't up for debate. My worth wasn't a group chat topic. After the confrontation, after the emails, after the voicemails, StopTie entered a silence I hadn't known in years. No calls asking for money, no guilt trips, no sudden emergencies I had to fund. Just me, my lake house, and the steady hum of a life finally owned. The quiet was strange at first, unfamiliar, like walking into a home you've only seen in photos. But it was also peaceful. I slept better, ate better, smiled more. I went on walks without checking my phone every 10 minutes. I reconnected with friends, built boundaries, reinvested in dreams I had set aside to play savior. I realized something profound during that time. I had been the parent for years, the emotional adult, the responsible one, the safety net. And now I was giving myself permission to stop. Not to be cold, but to be whole. 6 months after the wedding, I stood in the entryway of the home I bought entirely on my own. A 3-bedroom Victorian in Lincoln Park. Sunlight spilled through the stained glass, windows like an affirmation from the universe. "This is yours. Not inherited, not given as a favor. Not a guilt-ridden hand-me-down, mine, every board refinished. Every room painted with intention. It wasn't just a house, it was my healing." The down payment came from commissions I had earned through grit, not entitlement. I selected every tile, fixture, and fabric with care, grounding myself in my vision. It had space for rest, space for celebration, and space to grow into the woman I was always becoming. That house stood not only on a foundation of brick, but on the backbone I had built. This home whispered to me every morning, "You are not just enough. You are everything they overlooked." It reminded me I could thrive without being needed, that I didn't need to chase belonging, I could create it. With my family at a distance, I rediscovered who I was outside of obligation. I signed up for a painting class I'd always postponed, joined a book club, took weekends at the lake house without guilt. I stopped checking my phone at dinner. I said no one, didn't explain. I wasn't rebelling. I was reclaiming. I poured into friendships that had waited patiently while I prioritized others. Rachel remained my anchor, but new connections emerged, women who weren't intimidated by my success, who celebrated my wins instead of minimizing them. My network deepened in both my personal life and in business. The more I invested in myself, the more I attracted what I had always lacked: reciprocity. I no longer apologized for being strong. I stopped shrinking in rooms to make others comfortable. I learned that peace isn't passive, it's protected. My lake house evolved too, from rental investment to sacred retreat. I added an office, redesigned the interiors, and claimed it fully as mine. No longer a backup plan for anyone else. Just a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe, think, create. I finally wrote the business plan I'd been sitting on for years and launched a new real estate mentorship program for women entering the industry. Instead of giving my energy to a family that depleted me, I poured it into women who reminded me of myself: ambitious, overlooked, underestimated. The return was exponential. My mentees flourished. My income doubled. But more importantly, my purpose expanded. I wasn't just building wealth, I was building legacy. And legacy, I learned, isn't what you leave behind. It's what you live. I no longer lived waiting for inheritance. I was the inheritance. I became the person younger me needed to see. With space and perspective, I redefined what family meant. It was no longer a title reserved for those who shared my blood. It was earned through trust, mutual respect, and emotional safety. Monthly lunches with my father continued. They were simple but honest. We didn't pretend everything was fine. We addressed what had been broken. And little by little, something new took root: authenticity. My father, now in therapy, began to recognize his own patterns of avoidance. He didn't just apologize. He changed. He asked questions he never used to ask, listened longer, spoke less. There was still grief for what we'd lost, for what could have been, but there was also possibility. My mother took longer. Her apology, when it finally came, was cautious and stiff, but it opened the smallest crack in the door. And sometimes, healing only needs a crack to start. Sometimes, we don't rebuild, we build different. And that can be even more sacred. Watching my sister's marriage unravel wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. The house she'd been gifted began to deteriorate, just like the fantasy it represented. Peeling paint, overgrown shrubs, unpaid contractors. Her curated life, once polished and enviable, now carried cracks that mirrored the foundation of entitlement it was built upon. I didn't gloat. I simply observed and learned. I realized the home wasn't just a gift, it had been a test. One, my parents failed. One, I passed by walking away with my integrity intact. I stopped trying to prove I was worthy of being chosen. I stopped begging for recognition. That chapter of my life, the people-pleasing daughter, the silent giver, the invisible backbone, was over. In its place stood someone reborn in truth. I no longer needed their validation. I had my own. My wisdom was hard-earned and undeniably mine. Today, I live differently. My mornings begin with stillness and intention. I no longer rush to fix what isn't mine. My phone doesn't buzz with family demands. My heart doesn't ache with confusion about my worth. I'm building a future on my own terms. With boundaries, with freedom, with joy that isn't compromised, with love that doesn't demand a sacrifice of self. Jake came into my life not as a savior, but as a mirror. His empathy, his patience, his understanding of what real connection looks like, it all reflected what I had learned to offer myself. We move slowly, we speak openly, and for the first time, love feels safe. Not transactional, not earned through exhaustion, just received. My story began with a house, but it ends with a home within myself. A home no one can give or take away. If you've ever been the one who gave without being seen, who sacrificed while others celebrated, who carried the weight so no one else had to, story is yours too. Let it remind you, boundaries aren't walls, they're doors to a different life. You don't have to abandon love to protect your soul. You just have to choose you first. You are not selfish for wanting peace. You are not wrong for saying no. You are not alone in the pain of family betrayal. But you can be the one who ends the cycle. Who builds differently? Who lives freely? And if you're ready to take that step, subscribe, join this community, and walk with others who've learned that self-respect is the most sacred inheritance of all.